President, I came to the floor of the Senate last night to talk about a big choice President Biden was going to make today. Unfortunately, he made the wrong choice for America, for our allies, for Alaska, for my constituents. And the choice was whether he was going to make a big decision to shut down two of the biggest resource development areas in America, a place we call the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska and the Ambler Mining District of Alaska, some of the biggest deposits of critical minerals in America and the world, and one of the biggest, most prolific basins for oil and gas in the world, where we in Alaska produce these minerals and these resources which we need better than anybody with the highest environmental standards in the world. Well, the president shut them down today. Shut them down today. Certainly hurt American workers, benefited the dictators of the world. He won't sanction Iran for oil and gas, but he sure as hell will sanction Alaska. A little crazy. If you're an American watching, you might be like, why would we do that? Well, I'm going to get to that, Mr. President. So it's a real disappointment, dispiriting day in Alaska. But, Mr. President, I talked about how infuriating this was, particularly for my constituents, workers, Alaskans, but particularly for the Inupiat Alaska Native people who live on the North Slope of Alaska, who one of these rules, the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska rule, directly impacts them. I'm frustrated. Senator Murkowski is very frustrated. Congresswoman Peltola is very frustrated. We put out a press release denouncing this decision this morning. But, Mr. President, the people who are really, really frustrated, and to be honest, insulted, are these great Americans, these great indigenous leaders in my state, because they're the ones that this rule is going to impact. This rule is about the North Slope of Alaska, incredible place. They're the leaders. They're the indigenous people who live there. And as I mentioned in my remarks last night, Mr. President, the Biden administration just won't listen to them at all. You want to talk about canceled voices for indigenous Americans? Biden administration won't listen to them. This group of great Alaska Natives, as I mentioned last night, have come to Washington, D.C. These are the elected leaders of the North Slope, where this rule was solely going to impact. They came to Washington, D.C., flew 4,000 miles, 8 different times to meet with Secretary Haaland and say, Madam Secretary, this is our land. Don't do this. You're going to hurt our future. You're going to hurt our prospects to live. We've been living there for 10,000 years. You know how many times Secretary Haaland met with these great Americans? 8 different trips to Washington, D.C.? 0. 0. So again, Mr. President, I'll just show real quick because it's really important. This is the area of Alaska that I'm talking about, the North Slope, right up here. Okay? This whole area, the North Slope of Alaska, includes ANWR, includes the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska. This is a rule that's going to impact this whole area. By the way, this area is about the size of Montana. Okay, we're a giant state. And these are the leaders. We have a borough, elected borough, and a mayor, borough assembly. We have tribal leaders. We have leaders of Alaska Native corporations. So these are all the elected Inupiaq leaders. This part of the state. That's where the rule was announced today. And every one of them tried to come here and say, President Biden, Secretary Haaland, don't do that to us. That's going to really harm us. And we know more about our land than you guys do. We've been living there for 10,000 years. These are great Americans. So their voices were canceled, Mr. President. But I will tell you, when I saw the press release from the President of the United States today and Secretary Haaland today on this decision, I don't think I've ever been more disgusted in my 9 years as a U.S. Senator from what I saw from this White House, from this president, and this Secretary of Interior. And here's why, Mr. President. And you know me, I'm a pretty calm guy. I don't use words like lying and, okay? Here's what happened today. This administration won't listen to these great people. Never did, okay? So they're canceling their voices. Then, today, they're stealing their voices. Stealing their voices. As I said, Mr. President, I've never seen anything more despicable than this. The Biden administration won't listen to these great Americans, but then when they put their press release out today, they're telling the rest of the country, we're doing this to benefit the indigenous people of the North Slope. That's in the press release. They won't listen to them because they don't want the rule. And then when they put the statement out today, they told the American people, we're doing this to help these great Americans. Stunning. Mr. President, that's what you call a bald-faced lie. So, here's a statement from President Biden himself, a couple hours old, and he said, quote, I am proud that my administration is taking action to conserve more than 13 million acres of their land and to honor the culture, history, and enduring wisdom of Alaska natives who have lived on and stewarded these lands since time immemorial. That's the President of the United States statement. That's a bald-faced lie because he's saying, I'm the president. I'm doing it to help these great Alaska Native people. And guess what? They were totally opposed to this rule. And Secretary Haaland wouldn't even meet with them. It gets worse, Mr. President. Here's Secretary Haaland's statement. She said, we're taking this action today to, quote, safeguard the way of life for the indigenous people, those people who have called this special place their home since time immemorial, unquote. That's Secretary Haaland. Mr. President, this is just unbelievable. Like I said, I've never seen anything like this. The Biden administration won't listen to the indigenous leaders of the very place they're going to do a huge rule on, negatively impacting their lives. And then when they put the statement out on why they're doing it, they tell the rest of the country, we're doing it to help them. I've never seen such hypocrisy in lying from the president, from the Secretary of Interior. And by the way, Mr. President, a little bit of an aside, it's not just lying, it's unbelievable hypocrisy, particularly as it relates to the Secretary of Interior. When she announced these proposed rules to lock up the North Slope of Alaska, she said she was going to do it because of the, quote, climate crisis and to deliver on the Biden administration's most ambitious climate agenda in history. Okay, so we're announcing rules. We're going to shut down the North Slope of Alaska, hurt these great Americans because of the climate crisis. We're going to go after Alaska and Inupiaq natives. So that was the goal, ignore their voices. But if Secretary Haaland was really interested in the climate crisis, Mr. President, I'm wondering why she doesn't do more with regard to her own state. Her own state. What am I talking about here? Mr. President, the first 2 years of the Biden administration, over half of all permits, 9,000 federal permits to drill for oil and gas on federal lands went to which state? Anyone guess? Alaska? Hell no, they're shutting us down every day. More than half, over 9,000 permits to drill for oil and gas on federal lands went to which state? You guessed it, New Mexico. Whose home state is that? Oh my gosh, the Secretary of Interior. Get this number. And look, if there's anyone in the press listening, can you please write this story? I'm going to get to that in a minute. At the beginning of the Biden administration, New Mexico, so New Mexico's in the red, gray is Alaska. Alaska's been about steady for well over a decade, about 500,000 barrels a day. It's a lot. We were a lot more at one point. Steady. At the beginning of the Biden administration, New Mexico was about 1 million barrels a day. You know where they are now? Almost 2 million barrels a day. Whoa. We're the radical environmentalists wanting to shut down New Mexico. Wait a minute, no one's touching New Mexico. They've increased production under President Biden by 1 million barrels a day on federal land. Where's our intrepid American press to write this story? Think about this one, Mr. President. Think about the flip side of all this. A Republican administration gets elected. They say, we're going to shut down the oil production of a Democrat state. We're going to crush the native people in that Democrat state. We're not going to listen to them at all. And then we're going to make sure that that Republican Secretary of Interior's home state is going to be drill, baby, drill on federal lands. 2 million barrels a day, increased by 1 million barrels a day. And what's this administration doing? Folks are shutting down Alaska. We're steady, 500,000. Drill, baby, drill for Secretary Holland in New Mexico on federal lands. If that story were happening right now, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they'd be writing about it every day. They'd be calling it a scandal. They'd be looking for corruption. They'd be calling for resignations. But this identical situation, I don't think the press has written about it once. No wonder the American people don't trust the media. Such an obvious story of hypocrisy to write about, and nobody does. But, Mr. President, I'm digressing here. I want to get back to what happened today. As I mentioned, the President and the Secretary put out statements today saying, well, we did this to help the Inupiaq Native people of Alaska on the North Slope. Well, Mr. President, it's a lie. It's a lie. Let me get back to this. It's simply not true. How do we know? Because I'm going to do what the Biden administration didn't do. I'm going to give voice to my constituents who live in this place that just got shut down today. Here's a press release, Mr. President. It's from a group called the Voice of the Inupiaq, the Arctic Inupiaq. I'd like to submit this for the record.
Without objection.
So let me just talk a little bit about the Voice of the Arctic Inupiaq. It is a nonprofit organization established in 2015 by the North Slope region's collective elected Inupiaq Native leadership. It is dedicated to preserving and advancing the North Slope Inupiaq culture and economic self-determination. It includes local governments, Alaska Native corporations, federally recognized tribes, tribal nonprofits across that entire North Slope region. The board of directors of The Voice previously issued a strong resolution in opposition to the Biden administration's NPR-A rule that went into effect today, impacting their ancestral homelands. Mr. President, just because it's really important, because I want to give a sense of how many people, it's literally tens of thousands that the Biden administration is ignoring. The Voice of the Inupiaq, the Arctic Inupiaq, constitutes the following communities and organizations: Point Hope, Point Lay, Wainwright, Utiavik, Etkasuk, Anatuvik Pass, Nuiksik, Kaktovik. Members include the Arctic Slope Native Association, Atkasuk Corporation, the City of Atkasuk, the City of Kaktovik, the City of Wainwright, the Inupiaq Community of the Arctic Slope, the Native Village of Atkasuk, the Native Village of Kaktovik, the Native Village of Point Lay, the North Slope Borough School District, the Luganik Corporation, the Inupiaq Corporation, the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, the City of Anaktuvik Pass, the City of Barrow, the City of Point Hope, Ilisavik College, Kaktovik Inupiaq Corporation, the Native Village of Barrow, the Native Village of Point Hope, the North Slope Borough, Nunamuyet Corporation, in the Village of Wainwright, and Tigiaga Corporation. That's who's represented. That's tens of thousands of my constituents, Mr. President. And they're all against this rule. And they all live in the region where the rule is going to impact my state. And these are great people, by the way, Mr. President. Whaling captains, veterans, Alaska Natives serve at higher rates in the military than any other ethnic group in the country. Patriots, they love America. They're defenders of their culture. They're generous. They're humble. I am so honored to represent these great Americans as their senator. So here's their letter, Mr. President, and I'm just going to quote from it because it shows just what a travesty and what a bunch of baloney the President of the United States and Secretary Holland's statements were today. Remember, they wouldn't meet with these people, these great people, and now their statements say we're doing it on their behalf. So let's see what they said in their press release today. The elected Alaska Native leaders who supposedly had this rule done for them by Joe Biden's graciousness. Big lie. Here's the president of the Voice of the Arctic Inupiaq, Nagaruk Harcharkik, who is a great American. Quote, the federal government has again excluded the indigenous North Slope Inupiaq from policy making by issuing a final rule for the NPR-A that does not reflect our community's wishes. Whoa, I thought Deb Haaland and Joe Biden said it did. He continues, this is a deeply concerning trend by the Biden administration that regularly claims to be the most indigenous-friendly government on record. Yet the Biden administration's record does not live up to its own rhetoric. As a result, the final NPR-A rule issued today will hurt the very residents the federal government purports to help by rolling back years of progress, impoverishing our communities, and imperiling our Inupiaq culture. To quote one of our great 20th century leaders, quote, there's not much you can do when your own government says, shut up. It hurts. That's the leader of the Voice in his press statement today. But Secretary Haaland and President Biden just put out a press statement saying, we did it to help that guy. It's a lie, Mr. President. It's a big lie. Let me get to some of the other leaders in this press statement. By the way, if you're a national media journalist, can you please quote this? One of you guys, please. New York Times, you never listen to the voice of the Native people. You cancel them all the time. Washington Post, come on, do your job. Quote these people. Don't just quote Haaland and Biden. It's frustrating. Okay, here's the mayor of the North Slope Borough. So remember, this is a big borough, huge actually. Like I said, I think it's bigger than Montana. Josiah Puckatuck, I happen to know him very well too. He's a great American, wonderful leader. Here's what he said. The mayor, remember, he's elected, borough mayor, he's a Inupiaq native. The Department of Interior seems to believe that they can care about this land, our land, more than we do. Mayor Josiah Puckatuck said, the elected leaders of the North Slope Native leaders, spoke in unison in opposition to this rule during the rulemaking process. To refuse to listen to our voices is to say that you, federal government, Joe Biden, Secretary Haaland, you know better than the people who have been this land's stewards for the past 1,000 years and who depend on its continued health for our own survival. This is the mayor of the North Slope Borough. He continues, we deserve the same right to economic prosperity and essential services as the rest of the country, as other fellow Americans. And we are being denied that opportunity to take care of our residents and community with this decision by the Biden administration. It is insulting and, unfortunately, representative of the federal government's treatment of our indigenous voices for decades. So, Mr. President, and I'm talking now President Joe Biden, don't keep calling yourself the most important administration with regard to indigenous people. You are screwing the people of the North Slope of Alaska. Let me continue. This is another leader, Tribal Secretary Doreen Levitt, who I also know from a great family. Quote, as the North Slope's federally recognized tribe, we have experienced a severe lack of progress, meaningful engagement, including a lack of notice for tribal consultation, something we are still waiting for to this day from the Biden administration. As a federally recognized tribe, we are required to follow federal laws and policies when engaging in government-to-government relationships, but the Biden administration has failed to follow its own policies, executive orders, and department consultation guidelines, unquote. So that's the tribal secretary. Let me give you a couple other quotes, Mr. President. This is from the CEO of the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, President and CEO Rex Rock Sr., who is a really good friend of mine, like a brother to me. He says, quote, on multiple occasions, the elected leadership of the North Slope shared with the Biden administration officials our unified opposition to this rule. The Biden administration has chosen to ignore the consensus opinion of indigenous organizations from our regions. Remember, Mr. President, this rule only impacts their region. He continues, as stewards of the Arctic for millennia, the North Slope and Inupiaq know our lands better than anyone else. Alongside our region's tribes, local governments, and Alaska Native Village corporations, we will continue to fight to have our voices heard. Well, they certainly weren't heard at all in this case, Mr. President. By the way, in their press release, they give this narrative, just so you know I'm not making it up. Here's what they said about consultation. This is in their press release. Hope the New York Times writes this story. Local indigenous elected leaders made every effort to highlight the negative repercussions of this proposed NPR-A rule to the White House and the Department of Interior. But they were stonewalled repeatedly by federal officials more concerned with advancing their proposal than listening to the legitimate concerns of the indigenous people of the North Slope. They continue. Secretary Deb Haaland herself ignored or denied at least 8 meeting requests from North Slope and Inupiaq elected leaders, including an inexcusable decision to deny a meeting during a recent multi-day trip to our home state of Alaska. Wow. Wow. Mr. President, no kidding, I'm like getting sick to my stomach here. I'm so mad. Let me end with one more quote from another great leader, the Iluganuck Corporation President and CEO, Hugh Pakatuk, who I also know well. He says, quote, this NPR-A rule and the process by which it has been finalized is a setback for our corporation and the future generations of Alaska Natives who intend to continue living on our lands, the lands of our ancestors in our Inupiaq community of Wainwright. They are a private landowner neighboring the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska. He continues, Today's final rule was not something we asked for, was not something we wanted, or is something we support. This was imposed on them. But Joe Biden says they wanted it. He continues, as the neighboring landowner to the NPR-A, we are frustrated this rule could impede responsible infrastructure and economic development opportunities for our community. I will reiterate what I've said previously. When a government entity writes rules about the area in which our people live and subside, they must come to us first. Mr. President, in this case, they never came to them at all. Complete ignoring of the Alaska Native voices in my state. That did not happen here, he concludes. So, Mr. President, let me conclude. As you can tell, I'm frustrated. Senator Murkowski is frustrated. Congresswoman Peltola is frustrated. The whole state of Alaska is frustrated. As I mentioned, this is now 62 executive orders and executive actions exclusively focused on Alaska from the Biden administration to shut us down. The vast majority of the people I'm honored to represent have been opposed to every single one of them. But this one is the ultimate insult, because the President of the United States today used his voice to lie to the American people and say, I'm doing this on behalf of the Alaska Native people who live in the North Slope region. That is a lie. Okay? And you just heard directly, and I hope the media writes it, that is a lie. It is a sad and dispiriting day for me, my constituents, but in particular, the Native leaders of Alaska, whose voices were canceled, whose Secretary Holland never listened to them. That was a press conference we all did with the banner, Secretary Holland, here are our voices. She didn't. By the way, that's her job. Trust responsibility for the Native people of America. Certainly failed on that today. But, Mr. President, as I mentioned yesterday, more broadly, this administration is fine with sanctioning Alaskans, Alaska Natives in particular, but heck, Iran, New Mexico, Venezuela, Russia, it's drill, baby, drill in their parts of the world. Both President Biden and Secretary Holland didn't do their consultations and now have put out statements insulting these great people by saying that what they did today was to benefit them. It's going to harm them. You just heard their voices. I'm not canceling their voices. I'm trying to lift up their voices. We all know what's really going on here, Mr. President, and that's President Biden doesn't care about these people. He's taken direction directly from far left, lower 48, eco-colonialists, what we call eco-colonialists. Lower 48 radical environmental groups who come up and try to tell the Alaska Native people how to live their lives. Eco-colonialists who don't give a damn about the indigenous people of the North Slope of Alaska and who the president thinks he needs for his reelection. So he's appeasing them. He's certainly not listening to my constituents. Like the dictators in Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing, these eco-colonialists are overjoyed by this decision of the Biden administration today to shut down major resource development areas in America. While the Alaska Native people who have lived in the North Slope region for thousands of years are despondent, discouraged, and insulted. So am I, Mr. President. But we collectively will continue to fight this administration, and when we have to, like today, expose the lies that they are telling to the American people. I yield the floor.